So here we're looking at the third part of ecosystem ecology and the last video in this unit. And so we're wrapping up ecology here. And basically in this video will be relatively short, talking about human impact on the ecosystems. We talked about harvesting, so don't need to go a whole lot more here. I do want to talk about an idea called critical load. And critical load is an idea that plants can only absorb so many nutrients. You know, it's kind of like a bucket can only hold so much water. And so one of the issues with fertilization is over fertilization is a problem because if a plant can't absorb those nutrients, where do they go? Well, they go into the soil, they may stay there, or they may run off into the water supply and eventually find their way to lakes, which we'll talk about in a minute. And so there's some problems with fertilization, but obviously, as a civilization, agriculture is part of how we eat. And so there's a balance that has to happen here. And, it's a constant trying to find that right balance, but there's wrong and right ways to do that, obviously. Let's talk a little bit about acid rain or acid precipitation. Um, This largely has to do with the burning of fossil fuels and putting things into the atmosphere like CO2 and other compounds, sulfur. And so if you think about, CO2 is just CO2 in the atmosphere, carbon dioxide and water mixing together. It's in there, forms a compound called carbonic acid, which is found in like soft drinks and that sort of thing. And so that carbonic acid can rain, get into that precipitation, and at a low enough pH can cause some issues. Rainwater typically has a lower pH than tap water or whatever anyway, but with more and more fossil fuels in that, it can cause particular issues. Anything lower than a pH of 5.6 is considered acid precipitation. This can be even worse with nitrogen and sulfur compounds because sulfuric acid and nitric acid are stronger acids than carbonic acid and can cause some problems. Causes leaching in plants. I think I have a picture or two of this. Here's some acid rain measurements over here in the coal belt and industrial areas. Really low pHs. It's like I think it's pH of coffee, maybe around that. So it's pretty acidic if you're a plant. It's not something that you're used to, whereas over here, not as much, a lot more trees too. So there's a balance, but you can definitely see where the industry is in our country. And here's what we mean by leaching. And so leaching is nutrients are moved away from the roots. The plants aren't able to grow and they're starved from that. Another cause for concern is something called biomagnification. Biomagnification is the idea that trace amounts of harmful elements in the small organisms will lead to larger amounts of trace of those harmful elements found in the up in the food chain. And this should make sense to us if we understand kind of how food webs work. And so, and this picture really shows you, but I'm going to kind of demonstrate this. If we have, 5 planktons and they all have one piece of bad thing in them, well, those planktons are getting eaten by other things, right, that are not as bad. And so these, let me draw one more to make this even. So these are all got 2 in them, right? And then have another 2 over here just for effect. You get the idea. It's getting at the top, that thing is getting a large amount of bad, whatever that bad is going to be. This particular says concentration of PCBs. There was a chemical that you've probably heard of, this chemical DDT, which is used to be used um, as an insecticide. Well, what was happening is there was a buildup of DDT in bald eagles, and it was actually causing their eggs to be fragile because bald eagles eat fish and the fish eat small things, and you get the idea of this big kind of picture. And so when the bald eagles would sit on their eggs, the eggs would just kind of crush, which isn't good for bald eagle populations. And actually, bald eagle populations went down to almost nil in the early 70s, late 60s. And so this lady, Rachel Carson, she wrote about this. We mentioned her in a previous video. She wrote about the problem with this, and it led to DDT actually being banned in 1971. DDT would later find its way to wrestling rings all over the country as a wrestling move. And so another thing here about the rising CO2 levels and how that goes with temperature. CO2 kind of acts as a bubble. It's not a really good way of thinking about it, but you get the idea. The CO2 kind of forms an envelope around the Earth, and that blocks UV rays from returning back to space. And so they kind of bounce around in our inside of our own atmosphere, thus warming temperatures. And so you can see here there's a direct correlation. CO2 levels rise, as do temperature levels. There's not a whole lot of dispute here. Um, Numbers are numbers, and you can't really dispute them. So you have to ask yourself, well, what is the root cause of this? There are a lot more people than there used to be, and that's probably most of it. But then there are also, we burn a lot more fossil fuels. There's a lot of issues here, and so, the solution is uh, daunting, and it's a hard thing to understand, and it could just be normal cycles of the Earth, but it's probably some mix of those things. There have been other chemicals that have since kind of gone away. You've heard about the ozone layer, and the ozone layer kind of protects the Earth from those UV lights, and the hole was being formed in the ozone layer. One of the reasons for that was something called a chlorofluorocarbon, or a CFC. They were found in a lot of like aerosol cans, and the idea was maybe these were finding their way up to the atmosphere and causing a hole in the ozone layer. And there's you've probably seen these pictures where you have this hole over Antarctica, and no one lives in there anyway, but it does cause a problem for the whole Earth. And so this is a picture, 1979, no hole, 2000, big hole. But if you look at, there's varying amounts of, not data, but other pictures, and so this varies from year to year. That isn't to say that there isn't a problem. Absolutely there is, but sometimes it can be exaggerated, and so that you have to be careful with what you read, and obviously use wisdom and measure everything appropriately. But the Earth is warming up. It's indisputable, and a large portion of it probably can be attributed to the fact that we live here. And so we can all do better to um, do our parts in order to cause that to go down. Now, one thing I don't have a slide for is species extinction on Earth. This is something that we are directly responsible for. We are causing lots of species to go extinct. Um, this is more of a recent phenomena. You could make arguments for things like woolly mammoths and that sort of thing, but when woolly mammoths were walking the earth, we were walking the earth with spears, so it was kind of an even match. But the things that we were taking out with rifles and that sort of thing, definitely not an even match. And so it's it is concerning that a lot of scientists say that we are now in the midst of the newest great extinction event that doesn't involve an asteroid or a frozen globe or anything like that. It just involves a bunch of people acting stupid.